fine-grained password and account lockout policies. For those of you that have been around Windows Server administration for a while, you'd know that at the root of the Windows domain is a group policy object that determines the password policies that apply to all users in the domain. And whilst that worked pretty well, the problem was when you had a specific group of users or perhaps a specific department within your company that you either wanted to relax those restrictions or more likely tighten them for additional security. Well, you could sort of do it, but it was a messy process. For example, let's say you have a department, but you want to make that department's password policies a little tighter. One way you could have separate rules for that department was to create another domain, and then edit the default domain policy for that domain and make their password requirements much higher. But it's not really a desirable way of doing things, as creating another domain adds administrative overhead for your administrators, and of course it requires more hardware, and that's not always feasible, especially if you have a small company and a tight budget. So in Windows 2008 we now have the ability to create what Microsoft call fine-grained password policies, and this allows us to create separate password policies and apply them to an OU, for example, or perhaps to a group of users or even a single user, and have that policy apply only to them and the default domain policy apply to everyone else. However, in order to create these fine-grained policies, it's worth mentioning that you will need to have your domain running at the Windows 2008 functional level, or you simply won't be able to do it. So on our domain controller here, we're going to go and fire up the server management console by clicking on the little grey icon here next to the start button. Then up the top we're going to expand features, then we'll expand group policy management, and then our forest, domains, our domain winstructorlab.com, and let me just move this slider bar over so we can see things a little easier. And if we right click on our default domain policy and choose edit, this is going to fire up the group policy management console. And under the computer configuration heading, we're going to expand policies, and then Windows settings, security settings, and then account policies. And if we expand this so we can see this a little easier, we've got the two policies we're talking about, the password policy and the account lockout policy. Now every single user in your domain by default is going to be enforcing the settings that are defined in these two policy objects. So for the password policy, if we select that, in the right hand side we can see Active Directory is going to remember the last 24 passwords that a user has used, so they're not going to be able to use the same password again. Each password can only be used for a maximum of 42 days and a minimum of 1 day. It must be at least 7 characters long and meet complexity requirements, which means you will need to use a combination of uppercase and lowercase, numbers and special characters in the password. And finally, we're not going to be storing passwords in plain text, and that's what this last policy here determines. Now if we select the account lockout policy, over on the right you'll see that the default is that we don't have a specific lockout duration defined. Now when people enter in their passwords incorrectly a certain number of times in a secure environment, ideally we would be locking them out, but we're currently not doing that here. And the final policy, when enabled, will reset the account lockout assuming it's been locked after a certain time has expired. So these account and lockout policies is what we're talking about, and what we've seen are the default policies for our entire domain and every user inside our domain. In Windows 2008, we can create additional policies that can apply to specific targets in addition to our default domain ones. Let's say we've got a group of users that have really confidential data as part of their jobs, and we want to enforce a stricter password and account lockout policy on those users only, and leave the rest of our domain users to have the default policy. Well, now in Windows 2008, we can do it. So let's just minimize our group policy management editor here, and we'll go back to our server management console, and up the top here, we're going to expand roles. Then we'll expand Active Directory domain services, and then Active Directory users and computers. And finally, we'll expand our domain, winstructorlab.com. Okay, well, we're now going to right click on our domain and let's create a new OU. Now, I will point out that we don't have to create a new OU to implement these policies, by the way. I'm simply going to do this for our example, so we could take our high security users that we were talking about a moment ago and place them inside this OU for easier management. So let's just call this OU, we'll call it high security, and that'll be a lowercase I there, high security, and we can protect that container from accidental deletion if we like, which is the default. I'm going to turn that off for now, and we'll click OK. Now let's right click here on our high security OU, and we're going to create a new user account, and we'll give this guy a name. Let's call him Jordan, and we'll make his UPN the same, Jordan, and we'll click next. Now we'll need to give Jordan a password, so we'll do that. And at this point, I will mention that we're still only governed by our default domain policy, so in this case for our user Jordan here, his password only needs to be 7 characters in length, and as long as it meets the complexity requirements of our domain policy, it'll be fine. So we can enter in a password here, and I've entered in a password which is an 8-character password at the moment, so that's fine. I'm going to leave the other defaults here as they are. We'll click next and then finish. Alright, and there's Jordan's account ready to go, and he's able to log in with it. So now let's see how we can create a fine-grained password policy for all of the users inside our high security OU. Now, unlike our default domain policy that we already have applied to our domain, we won't be using the group policy management console you see here to create and apply a group policy object to our new high security OU. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. Presumably, Microsoft made it a little more difficult to implement these fine-grained password and account lockout policies so that only people that really know what they're doing would even bother taking the time to implement them. Now, in order to create these new policies, by the way, you will need to be a member of the domain admins group, or at least had the appropriate permissions delegated to your user account. So instead of using the group policy management console, we'll need to use ADSI Edit. So we're going to click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch ADSI Edit, which is referred to as ADSI Edit. And now we're going to right click on the top here at ADSI Edit, and we'll choose Connect To. Now right down the bottom of this window here, we can leave the default, which is the domain or the server that we're logged into, or we can select this radio button here and then enter in the name of a domain controller we want to connect to. In this case, that'll be my server DC1, and we'll click on OK. Now in the top left up here, you can see that we're connected to DC1, so we're going to expand this, and then we'll select our domain here, winstructorlab.com. We'll expand that domain, and down the bottom here, we're going to expand the system container, and we'll just move this over a little bit so we can see what we're looking at here. And then we're going to select the password settings container. In the middle of this console here, you can see that this container is currently empty. So we're going to right click and we're going to choose to create a new object here. And it's going to start up a small but probably unfriendly wizard. And that's okay, because in a couple of minutes you'll understand exactly what this wizard's asking. So it starts up with this window here where you can select an object class, and the only option is this MSDS password settings class, and that's what we need right now for our fine-grained password policy, so it's fine. We'll click next, and we'll need to give this object a name, which I'm simply going to call high security password policy. And we'll click next. Now here in our password settings precedence field, this is asking for a virtual value, and you can pretty much make up any number as long as it's a value that's higher than 0. However, what this setting really does is when 2 or more policies are applying to a target, then the one with the higher value is the one that's going to take precedence over the other one. That is with one exception. Now let's say we've created 2 of these policies and we've pointed them at our high security OU, of which our new user Jordan is a member. Now if one policy has a precedence of 10 and the other has a precedence of 20, then the one with 10 will win, unless there's another policy that's been created to point directly at our user Jordan. In that case, the user targeted policy will override the one targeted at the OU, as the user policy will always win. So let's just give this password settings precedence a value of 10. Not that it really matters in my case, since I'm only going to have this one policy, and in most cases it'll be the same for you guys, so you could put it at a value of 10, that's probably fine. And we'll click next. Now here we can set whether these users' passwords will be stored in plain text, and it's rare enough that you'd want to turn this policy on, and we certainly wouldn't want to be doing that in our high security OU. So I'm going to enter in false here, although if you do want to turn it on, you'd enter in true in this box, and then we'll click next. Okay, well here we have the password history length, which normally defaults to 24, and we can set this to whatever we like for our high security policy. So let's set this to something a little higher. We'll set it to 30, and we'll click next. Then we have whether the passwords need to meet the complexity requirements of our domain, which means passwords have to be at least 7 characters long and use a combination of uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and special characters in the password. So values here can either be true or false, so we will want to turn this one on for our high security OU, so we're going to call this one true, and we'll click next. Now the minimum password length on the default domain policy, you'll recall, is set to 7 characters. So for our high security policy, I'm going to set this to a higher value. Let's set it to 12, and we'll click next. Then we have the minimum password age, which you'd recall is normally 1 day, and that's fine. We'll leave it at 1. But unlike other fields, in this field, we can't just write 1, since it utilizes 64-bit integer 8-bit values. So this will need to be a negative value, and for 1 day, it's going to be this number here if I've got my calculations correct. And by the way, if you are looking for a converter to calculate these values, just go to your favorite search engine and look for a converter that'll convert days or hours or minutes to nanoseconds, which is what this field uses, and you should be fine. Now, or you could use a Windows calculator, of course, so we could click on Start, and we'll type in calc, and we'll launch that there. To calculate the value of 1 day, we'll enter in 24, since that's the number of hours in a day, and what we'll do is we'll times that by 60, since there's 60 minutes in an hour, and then we're going to times that by 60, number of seconds in a minute, and we'll get the value here of 86,400. Now, a nanosecond is a billionth of a section, so we're just going to add in 7 zeros to the end. So that would then be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we'll need to add a minus to the front, since this is going to be a negative number. So remember the minus, as it's important. If you don't want to use these sorts of values, you could use a more understandable format. And other formats here would be this value here for 1 day, 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. Or we could just enter in the text none or never for our other options as well. Anyway, that's enough on that. We're going to leave it as it is at this value here, which is a day. You can work that out if you like. And we'll click next. Now we have the maximum password age, which is the length of time we'll allow users to keep the same password. And that normally defaults to 42 days, but let's change this to say, we'll do a lower amount, say 7 days. That way our users will need to change their password at least each week. So for our 7 days, I'm going to use the same format as before that we talked about, which is 7 days, there's no hours, no minutes, and no seconds. And then we'll click next. Now if a user enters in their password incorrectly a certain number of times, we could choose to lock that account. And this is useful to prevent hacking attempts on a password. Now this does default to 0 in the default domain policy, which means accounts will never be locked out, so an attacker can continually attempt to brute force the account all day. Now, if you don't want this feature to be enabled, simply set it to 0. But if you do want accounts to be locked out after a certain number of failed attempts, then you could set this to a value of 1 through to 999. So let's lock out accounts after 3 failed attempts, and we'll click Next. Now here we can enter in the amount of time that we'll wait after a failed logon before we reset the number of failed logons counter. Now this defaults to 6 minutes. So to enter in 6 minutes, the value is going to be no days, no hours, 6 minutes, and no seconds. So we'll click Next. And finally, we can set the account lockout duration. And this is the number of minutes that we'll wait until a locked account is automatically unlocked. And this also defaults to 6 minutes, and that's fine. So we'll enter in 6 minutes here again. Again, days, hours, minutes, and seconds, and we'll click Next, and we're done. So we'll click Finish. At this point, we've created our policy, but it's just sitting there and it's not applying to anything. So in ADC Edit, we'll need to right click on the policy and choose Properties. Then we'll scroll down and we need to find this attribute, MSDS PSO applies to, and we'll select that and we'll click the Edit button. And from here, we can apply it to a Windows user account or a group by clicking on the Add button here and then typing in the name of the user or group, or we could use this window here to browse Active Directory for it. Now, if it's a different object, like an OU, we can add in a distinguished name. So we'll click Add DN, and then we'll need to enter in the Active Directory name for our high security OU. So that's going to be OU equals high security, comma, DC equals Winstructor Lab, comma, DC equals com. All right, we'll click on OK, and we can see that entry here in the list, and we can add in more if we like, but for now, we'll just click on OK. Okay, so we've logged off, and we'll need to log in using Jordan's account. So we're going to log in as Winstructor Lab Jordan, and we'll enter in the password we gave his account when we created it. So we'll log in, and as expected, the first thing it asks us is to change his password. So we'll try and enter in the password of just simply password right now, and we'll hit enter. And we're told here that it's been unable to update the password. The value provided for the new password doesn't meet our length, complexity, or history requirements of the domain. Well, it certainly does meet the length of the default domain policy. Our password was 8 characters in length. The domain policy only asks for 7. So let's try and enter in another password, which will be at least an 8-character password and definitely will meet the complexity requirements. We'll try that there. Again, we're getting the same error. So presumably here, our new password policy for the high security OU is kicking in, and Jordan is unable to use an 8-character password anymore, so we're going to have to change it to at least a 12-character password. So, thinking caps on, and we'll try and enter in a password here. And let's see if I can remember that password. Okay, fingers crossed. This time, his password changes fine, since the new password has met both the complexity requirements, which are still being enforced, of course, as well as the new minimum character requirements of at least 12 characters. Now I've just logged back onto our domain controller again, as I want to point out one more thing before we finish up here. And that's, once you've created your new fine-grained policy through ADC Edit, you can access it and modify the properties of it through Active Directory Users and Computers. So if we click on Start, and we'll go to Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Active Directory Users and Computers. Now at the top here, I'm going to click on View, and we'll select the Advanced Features. So that'll turn on the Advanced Features inside this console. So we're going to expand System, and we'll scroll down and we'll select the password settings container. And in the right hand side here, there's the policy that we created earlier. So we'll right click on it, we'll choose Properties, and then the Attribute Editor tab, and we can edit this just like before when we did it from ADSI Edit. Now, we can't create any new policies from here. We'll still need to go back to ADSI Edit for that, but we can edit, view, and even delete the existing policies here if we like. So in this video, we've talked about the new fine-grained password and account lockout policies available with Windows Server 2008. Now in Windows 2008, we're able to deploy separate policies to either reduce or more likely improve our password and account lockout policies in order to tighten up security for particular targets, and it's certainly a welcome feature, so I'd suggest taking a look. Now we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.